Hello. So, over the last week or so, I have been nonstop building planes. Why? Well, simply put, before this, I realized that I only had two planes capable of dogfighting effectively. An F-16 that was a pretty small scale and could not actually, didn't have many of the modern additions I would put on it, and also the F-35 I put in a previous video. No, you don't need to watch that video for context for this video, but it's a good video. You might want to consider it. So, obviously, I needed some more combat aircraft, and that's what I set out to do. And that's how I ended up building like seven or so realistic jets. So, the first one that I built was a MiG-21. The famous Dorito. Sorry, not Dorito, the pencil. The angry silver dart looking thing. I also want to use this chance to talk about some details in making aircraft that I don't think a lot of people notice. Now, for the people that actually do build a lot of aircraft, you probably do understand a whole bunch of the details of balancing the aerodynamics. Making sure it's stable, making sure it's unstable in other directions, stuff like that. But I also find that a lot of the people that aren't that invested in the game can't actually identify what is the problem in the aerodynamics. So for example, this MiG-21, it goes pretty fast, moves fine. If you notice, when I pitch up, it will have this little wobble after I finish pitching up. This happens because it is too stable. So if a plane has a wobble after doing a movement, that means that it is too stable along that axis. What this means is that if I pitch up, it overcorrects because the stability is trying to reorient my nose back to the direction of motion. And because it overcorrects, it swings it back the other way, and then the other way, and the other way, back and forth until it settles down. An easy fix to, fix this would to just be move the center of drag forwards. It's small stuff like these that I don't think a lot of people understand how to pick up on. So, just going to explain a few here. Another thing is the roll. As you can see, when I don't pitch up and I just fly level and straight and I roll, the roll is very fast. However, if I instead pitch up and roll, all of a sudden you'll see that the rolling is now significantly reduced. I had an F4 Phantom a while ago that demonstrated this much more effectively, but here it's not the pitch drag that's in the wrong place, but rather it's the roll forces that are being stabilized, and that is why there is less responsiveness. The roll axis is too stable. Now I'm sure all of you understand how yaw and pitch can be stabilized, but not many know how to stabilize a roll. If you think about it, when your plane is pitching up, you'll see that there is not only air coming in from the nose to the tail, but also up into the belly of the plane. And as you also know, if the center of drag is behind the center of mass, it is stable. So what this means is that when you pitch up and all of a sudden there's a bunch of air coming into the belly, the center of mass is in front of the vertical stabilizer. But now, because you're considering the entire thing at a different angle, that vertical stabilizer no longer just stabilizes yaw, it also stabilizes roll. And the reason why this is most obvious in pitching is because when you're pitching, you end up putting your nose up a lot more. However, during normal flight, this is also visible. It's just that during normal flight, your nose only pitches by about 1 to 5 degrees at absolute maximum. Whereas when you're pitching up, like actively, your alpha can go up all the way to like 30 degrees at times. Alpha being the term for the angle of attack of the plane against the air, the angle of the plane relative to its motion. The solution for this, just like all the other stability issues, is to simply move around the center of drag as needed by placing fins in different places. That is why some planes actually have smaller guiding fins underneath the tail. That is to balance out the size of the tail on top with something below to make sure that it stays relatively even, aerodynamically speaking. So yeah, the MiG-21 is now my main boom and zoom fighter, and it's pretty fun to use. But what if you're trying to build a recreation of a plane and you simply can't balance it? You can't shove in enough aerodynamic pieces in the correct spots, and you're forced to have an unstable aircraft. Well, there's actually ways to make unstable aircraft stable through other means except aerodynamics. For example, this is my Gripen. It's also, yes, I am aware I'm probably pronouncing that terribly. The concept here is to use speed sensors to detect the alpha of the aircraft. Basically, what happens is, since the plane is always moving forwards, if the alpha is positive, the air will be coming into the belly. If the alpha is negative, the air will be coming into the roof of the jet. So using speed sensors, you could detect when the air is coming in from the top or in from the bottom, which in turn tells you what angle it's facing in, which you could then use to correct. This is pretty much the basic concept. I'm sure you can see the logic gates here and how they're positioned, or rather the lack of them because of how simple this design is. But it's a really simple concept that can be applied to almost any jet to make any unstable plane relatively stable. As you can see here, this is the unstabilized Gripen, where I am just trying to fly it without using the speed sensors to assist me. It is possible, because this Gripen isn't that unstable, but it's very annoying and I can't fly level or steady for long. However, with the speed sensors, when properly tuned, it can fly perfectly level as well as any other jet. However, to tune this system, you need to understand when it's overcorrecting and when it's undercorrecting. What I mean by this is because it takes a lot of tuning to get the forces just right, you will need to recognize when it's going one way or the other way. And this might not seem like a big issue, but as someone who has ended up spending like an hour or so trying to fix this, it very much is. Basically, if you enter a turn and you can't stop the turn, that is undercorrecting. If you enter a turn and you get out of the turn, but then you keep going too far the other way, that's overcorrecting. It's harder to notice when you're actually in flight, so these descriptions may seem simple, but I ended up confusing them for quite a while, so be aware of that. Generally for tuning, I recommend using binary search because depending on the plane, the settings could be literally anything, so you're going to need to sweep through a lot of settings. A lot of it's just trial and error. If something's overcorrecting, make it smaller. If something's undercorrecting, make it bigger. It's just a whole bunch of trial and error for tuning. But yeah, this is roughly the basic concept for how to make fly-by-wire. Well, I call it fly-by-wire, but I do want to clarify that's not technically the correct term. Fly-by-wire is when the controls from the pilot is electrical and it gets sent to a computer, which then sends those signals to all the control sources instead of a direct link through a mechanical mechanism. Fly-by-wire, however, is often linked to, I don't know the right term, flight control system or something. It's the thing that makes unstable aircraft able to go stably. Basically, it does a whole bunch of corrections during the flight to keep it going where you're trying to go. So, after this, I built the F8. The F8 is, I think it's the F8 Vought or something. I don't know the names. I should call it the F8. This F8 is probably my stablest plane, and it is my go-to turn fighter. But speaking of turn fighting, well, first of all, I just want to comment on how perfectly stable it is when I don't have the extra lift active. So the F8 in real life has this thing where it can tilt its wings up 7 degrees, very useful for short takeoffs and more lift, and in turn fighting. But this is where I want to comment on something. I have talked to some people, and apparently not everyone recognizes that lift doesn't actually make you turn faster. So as you can see here, without the lift, I am turning circles. However, if I activate the lift, it doesn't make me turn in degrees any faster, but it does make the circle tighter. This is useful for dogfighting, and it is still beneficial, but the amount of degrees you turn is not linked to the amount of lift you have. Those are two separate things. They both help, they are not the same. More lift just allows you to end up going slower and spend more time turning because you need less speed to stay up in the air. Lift also, because it's the force that goes up relative to your plane, makes you turn tighter circles when you're turning upwards. Whereas actually pitch changes the amount of degrees per second you can rotate. Both matter, but pitch matters more. Lift is just a secondary thing which helps pitch do its thing. So yeah, this is my go-to turn fighter now, incredibly stable, flies perfectly level and straight, and can do nice maneuvers. All around, really like to build this thing. Also, the wing shape was a very nice challenge, and I had to fit all the control surfaces in it. Very interesting. So after the F8, I built the MiG-23, or was it the MiG-27? It was one of them. Don't actually remember which one it was based around. It was one of them. But basically what I want to talk about here is swing wings. Most people either have the swing wings linked to a toggle button so that they can manually set it, or they have it linked to the speed of the aircraft with a speed sensor. So after they reach a certain forward speed, they swap over to the swing wings in the other configuration. I would like to argue that this is suboptimal, because in a lot of scenarios, unless you're using it in a very specific way, it's better to have it linked to the lift of the aircraft rather than the speed of the aircraft. It's possible to measure it's possible to measure the lift of the aircraft by using speed sensors pointing up and down to see whether it's drifting up or drifting down. Again, from the lift. If the lift is more than enough, it should be drifting up. If the lift is not enough to counteract gravity, it should be falling down. The reason is quite simple. Normally, the MiG-23, MiG-27, which is based on speed, would not swing out its wings when you're trying to make a sharp turn, whereas this one does, because this one can detect because it needs more lift in a sharp turn. However, the MiG-23, MiG-27 doesn't. Also, swinging your wings forward makes you able to do a sharper turn not only because of the increase in lift, but because now the center of drag has been shifted forwards. This allows you to make even sharper turns because you are less stable. Overall, it's just small details like that. And another reason is if you fly upside down, you'll notice that the wings swing in. This is because lift is no longer counteracting gravity, it's going with gravity. So less lift is better when you're trying to fly upside down, and it recognizes that. So in a lot of little edge case scenarios, that's why I prefer using lift as the condition for the swing wing rather than using speed as the condition for the swing wing. However, this only works if you have enough lift for it to be a very large difference. And as you can see by my MiG-23 or MiG-27, it doesn't actually have enough lift. So when you're building recreations of real-life jets, a lot of the time you won't have enough lift to implement this properly. Unlike this example, so to speak, F-14, that is pretty much 90% wings and almost nothing body. Plus the body itself is very lightweight. So that's the swing wing section done. But back to unstable aircraft, and I'm doing these aircraft in chronological order, which is why I'm jumping around from talking about some subjects to other subjects. The next aircraft I built was the X-31. It's a NASA X-plane, which of course means that it looks incredibly weird, but also very interesting. The topics that I wanted to test on this one were simple. One, it's just more practice with making unstable aircraft stable using speed sensors. And two, this had another unique set of problems. The reason why this one was so unique was because thrust does not scale with speed. Drag scales with speed. So the instability scales with drag. So the methods used to counteract instability needs to scale also with speed, which is why the Gripen could handle low speed and high speed flight all the same. But this thing, it can't go above 250 kilometers per hour without having issues in control, because the thrust vectoring does not scale with the airspeed. This means that at low speeds it will overcorrect, thus the extreme wobble, and at high speeds it will undercorrect. Naturally, this causes a lot of problems and makes it really hard to fly and generally a nightmare to use. But proving this point is very important because you can't go all in on thrust vectoring when you're making unstable aircraft. It's simply just a really, really bad idea if you want it to operate at more than one speed. The other thing that I have done in this X-31 is that I have put a speed limiter on it, but it has very efficient aerodynamics, so it ends up going faster than the speed limit anyway. And the other thing is that I have added a constant logic gate input to make the system constantly pitch up slightly. I'm not sure if you have noticed or not, but the Gripen consistently had a very slight pitch down. So to correct this, it's possible to have a constant input to counteract that. Very simple, but it will also affect the amount of tuning that the pitch, that the speed sensor is detecting pitch will be at. So just more tuning stuff, but it is very useful to have it so that you can tune the exact amount of lift and the exact amount of droop or raise that the nose has in flight. Next up is the X-29. So for this one, the concept was to use a dead zone to make it fly smoother. Basically, because the speed sensors were set to really low airspeeds, even a slight alpha would trigger them very easily. By putting a gap of like 10 or so degrees in between them, it has this middle zone where it won't be responsive. This should prevent overcorrecting as much, and it is useful. But first I need to explain why you can't just have the speed sensors set to very high speeds. The reason is because that is less effective at detecting alpha depending on your airspeed. Simply put, I recommend having your speed sensors set to 5 kilometers per hour because if it's 100 kilometers per hour, sure, you'll need a higher alpha. But at low speeds, you'll need like an alpha of, 60 degrees for it to trigger. But at high speeds, you'll only need an alpha of 5 degrees for it to trigger. Simply put, it's a lot more inconsistent depending on the airspeed. So you can't just set the airspeed at which it detects the changes to be different. You have to angle the speed sensors themselves for it to properly function. And yeah, this dead zone definitely does make it more stable, as you can see here. Even with multiple powered tail fins on the nose, it still flies very stably, very consistently. To further prove this point, here I have a version that doesn't have an active stabilizer system, and as you could see, it's pretty much completely unflyable. And yes, this version also has a slight input to the control surfaces to make it constantly pitch up slightly. And yeah, that's how this thing flies super stably while it being super unstable. Pretty interesting, pretty neat stuff. And for the final thing in this video, I made the X-36. The X-36 is another X-plane made by NASA, as it is. This one, however, has no vertical stabilizer. This means that it is unstable both in pitch and in yaw, which was an absolute nightmare. As you can see here, the unstabilized version is completely unflyable. Like maybe a little bit at lower speeds, but it's really hard to use, and it's really annoying to use. But when it's stabilized, as you could see in this version, it flies surprisingly steady, surprisingly fast, and it's pretty responsive. So this used a culmination of all the other effects to make it into this. If you look at the forces, you'll see that the yaw is incredibly unstable. For the yaw, I only have thrust vectoring, which does not scale with speed. This is a problem, however, I also don't really have a solution for this in this design. The reason is I try to use decelerons, basically wingtip things that slow you down, but the problem is that the speed at which those respond is very slow. So they aren't actually responsive enough to correct in time. So unironically, it's just better to just use thrust vectoring. And for pitch, I used a combination of both thrust vectoring as well as the canards, which is the fins near the front. And overall, yeah, it's just a very cool looking jet that is incredibly unstable, but can now be made stably. And I hope that this shows you how to make your own jets incredibly stable. And as a side note, yes, this one does have logic gates that constant on output to set the stuff to make it pitch up slightly because it has no lift. But yeah, that's about it. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. That's it. Goodbye.